legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Mark Stavish. In a talk inspired by the 1959 post-apocalyptic science fiction novel A Canticle for Leibowitz, Mark discusses the preservation of knowledge, in particular occult and esoteric knowledge, as the world plunges into an ever more uncertain and unstable future. From an over-reliance on technology to a lack of preparedness and widespread general apathy, the potential threats to the entire library of human knowledge are growing in size and number. Spellbound by the myth of progress, the belief that progress is linear and ever upward, we are blind to the harsh lessons of history, the dark ages, wars, and catastrophes, man-made or natural, which mark the downfall of peoples, nations, and entire civilizations, and the heritage of their time. Although ancient knowledge has a way of surviving eons of trial and tribulation, in this era of perhaps unprecedented danger, we would do well to consider what is in peril and what can be saved for our own sake and for the sake of those who come after us. Hello and welcome, Mark, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be back. It's been a little while. We haven't spoken since the coronavirus years.
Well, we did speak during that time, but I can't remember exactly which what the conversation was. But in any event, people will find links to our previous talks on the interview page for this talk at legalizefreedom.com, so it's all there, and of course links to your own online presence and resources. I had the idea for today's talk because I've been doing some research for my TV and movie review series, which takes the form of vlogs, called Hauntology and Dystopia. And I was reading about a 1959 science fiction book, A Canticle for Leibowitz. I'll tell people about that in a second. And I kept thinking back to it when I was reading some of your social media posts about your work with the Institute for Hermetic Studies and your fundraisers and book collecting and whatnot. And there seemed to be a big overlap. So I thought it'd be quite fruitful to talk about what I described in my recorded introduction here, which, is the preservation of knowledge, particularly, esoteric knowledge, going forward, and not just in the coming decades, but centuries and maybe even millennia. It's quite a big issue. I'll get you to introduce yourself in a second and talk about the Institute for Hermetic Studies and your fundraising efforts. But first of all, I'll just briefly, for people who don't know, I have a paragraph about this novel that set the whole thing in train. So, published in 1959, A Canticle for Leibowitz is a post-apocalyptic social science fiction novel by American writer Walter M. Miller, Jr., set in a Catholic monastery in the desert of the southwestern US after a devastating nuclear war. The book spans thousands of years as civilization rebuilds itself. The monks of the Albertian Order of Leibowitz preserve the surviving remnants of man's scientific knowledge until the world is again ready for it. So that's kind of a thematic background. But again, for listeners who haven't maybe listened to any of our other talks, say a little bit about yourself, your work, the Institute.
Well, I'm the founder and director of studies of the Institute for Hermetic Studies. We've been going since 1998. I've been involved in this stuff since I was young. I was born into it, really. My family was involved in Pennsylvania German folk magic. Not just the folk magic, but what's called the higher end of it and the philosophical end of it, such as, Bhima and Swedenborg and that sort of thing. My great uncle, who I spent a great deal of time with, was involved with all of the major esoteric orders of the mid part of the 20th century, and he died in 1996 at 96 years of age, and was kind of the grand old man in some Rosicrucian circles, because of who he knew and what he was involved with. And of course, part of his work as a really laborer, he was built cars and radios back in the day when you could do such things. He was an engineer on the railroad, and he devoted a great deal of his time and resources meaning money, to helping build esoteric organizations and infrastructure. And he put his his money where his mouth was, and was very generous for a man of limited means, both to organizations and to his family. So being around that and the people of those years, of course, it's very important to know that this was in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, and it was a different bunch of people involved. We see a shift later on, and in an effort to kind of address some of that shift and some of the promises of the period, some of which we'll talk about, which have panned out, and most of which haven't, I established the Institute, and we've been going again since 1998 to the present. And we have online courses, we have live seminars, mostly live conference once a year usually around the first weekend in June. And well, that's it. That's who we are. That's what we do. And so I've been doing this forever.
Okay, so listeners are probably already beginning to imagine, conjure up potential threats to the survival of knowledge and information of whatever type. Could be esoteric, could be technical, scientific, cultural, whatever. Just a full gamut of human knowledge, really, as we move into an increasingly uncertain and potentially dangerous future. And as I say, you've been doing some work fundraising, and you've posted some beautiful photos of the various tranches of books, various volumes that have been donated or purchased using donations. We don't have to cover the full. I just want to know what you think about what the threats are going forward, to the preservation of the knowledge we're talking about in particular, but knowledge in general, because a lot of people got the idea now that we're at some kind of zenith of knowledge, and that because of technology, this is all this spreads so widely, and there's so many copies of everything, that all of this going forward is safely preserved. But it really isn't. There's environmental and ecological threats to infrastructure. We have energy resource problems going forward, and then there's political and social threats. Upheaval, different regimes, different ways of looking at things. And you don't have to go very far back in history to see, whereas McCarthyism or the Second World War, radically different opinions coming into power, and the previous knowledge sets being deemed unacceptable, whatever it happens to be. So I just wanted to know what you thought about what's forefront in your mind going forward, certainly for the rest of your lifetime, that you see are important to prioritize.
Well, we can do a laundry list of threats, but the greatest threat is indifference.
Yeah.
It's laziness. I mean, that really is the reality. We exist right now at a time when we have opportunity to see potential, we'll call them threats, okay, situations, scenarios. Some real and possible and probable, others more fantastic and imagined, but we can see them. We have the luxury of being able to see them, and we have the luxury of being able to prepare for them. And reality is, the occult community, with which I'm mostly concerned with, doesn't. There's not much more to say than that. It fundamentally does not view preparing or planning or being an adult in the room as being part of the esoteric path. And that's primarily a phenomenon within the various schools of Western esotericism. And nothing can be seen as a better example of that than the horrific personality driven and not so much personality driven, later politically driven, ideologically driven flame wars that we saw in the late 90s. And then, of course, with political correctness and political indoctrination as being a major part of a litmus test for membership in different groups, the way many organizations tore themselves apart over the last 4 to 5 years, 6 years. So when we look at planning for the future, that was never part of their model. And I think we have to just state very clearly right now for the record that esotericism right now, Western esotericism, and even some of the Eastern schools, particularly the schools of Buddhism that I'm familiar with, to Vajrayana Buddhism, are remedial at this point as compared to what was going on, say, 30 years ago. We have decreased. Now, what Western esoteric groups are very good at, and I think we have to, this is where the confusion comes in. This is where the error creeps in. We see them as being very good at the 3 Ps. Podcasts, they're very good at publishing, and they're very good at products or merchandise. But the old 3 Ps of perfect, peace, profound, not so much. And we have to really ask ourselves, why is that, and how can we correct it?
Well,
and what happens here is that there is, and again, I have to use the language that fits, an incredibly infantile view, a very childish view, in which it's here for me to take advantage of. Everything is reduced to a kind of transactional relationship, rather than, how am I fitting into this group, this chain, this movement, this idea, and what is expected of me in return. We used to hear that when you approach the Temple of the Mysteries, you are asked the question, what is it you wish? I wish to know why in order to serve. The idea of service and duty, those are not words, along with virtue. These are not words, even though it's all over the tree of life, vices and virtues. These are not words that you hear much. Now, in the last few years, you have, but it's mostly coming out of the revival of the Stoicism. So as you see Stoicism become more prominent as a philosophical view, and then we see more, we hear more of a mention of those ideas. But realistically, for the last 30 to 40, 50 years, 30 years in particular, the spiritual movements which we are associated with not only have degenerated, as they've flattened out, they've widened, they've had more cultural appeal and greater cultural presence. We can see that in Netflix and Amazon Prime and all sorts of culture. But that has not been taken advantage of to build a long-term infrastructure.
If listeners are unfamiliar with Stoicism, they might know it in a sort of everyday sense, but at legalizedfreedom.com, I can't remember the title of the talk, but with an author there, we talk about, he wrote a book about Seneca, Stoic philosopher, so that might be worth for folks to check out. I just finished reading The Kybalion, if that's indeed how you pronounce it, just something I'd never ever done, and just a short, succinct little book summing up the Hermetic philosophy. And also recently did a show with Kingsley Dennis on a book called The People of the Secret. And it surely should be obvious, looking at history of esotericism, occultism, that knowledge is passed down over millennia, countless millennia, from person to person, organization to organization, sometimes being persecuted, having to hide, go underground. Who knows how the knowledge has changed, or over time, and great risks have been taken, in response to great threats to preserve some of this. So, if the past was all about this kind of, glacial long-term thinking and weathering of cycles of dark ages and golden ages. Why would anyone think that changed now? I mean, I suppose our time frames have shrunk so greatly. We struggle to think, even in terms of a few decades. It's kind of like it's strangely enough, as technology has advanced, our sense of time seems to have somehow contracted, and there was clearly people, organizations in the past that have been thinking in terms of what we do in our lifetime is just, a grain of sand on the beach, and other people will carry forward what we've done. And to me, it just seems blindingly obvious. And I've never been a part of any esoteric or occult group. I've resisted that actually for just for not reflexive reasons, but it just didn't feel right. I've never been very good at communal activities, but I'm sure there's other reasons for that as well. When we had a conversation about Freemasonry, I mentioned during that talk that at that time, the local Freemasons in my city had gone on a recruitment drive to the extent that they were actually advertising on social media, to come and have an introductory talk, come down and see what we're about. So I know there's a lot in what I've just said there, but you can respond to any of that if you can.
I think it's really simple. It's called wealth, the luxury of wealth. And, the purpose of technology is to contract time. It's to overcome the problems of time and space so that it doesn't take you, 3 days to get somewhere. It only takes you maybe 3 hours. So we look at technology, it makes things very easy. And that when things are very easy, people often have the belief that it's always been that way, or maybe it hasn't always been that way, but it is now, and therefore it will be into the future. There is a lack of understanding of how things work cyclically. In fact, I would say a lack of it. There's outright denial of it. And part of this you see in the fundamental notion of history being on a one-way track, always onward and upward. So I think some people call this, Greer calls this the myth of progress. And it's what happens when you're simply not paying attention. And we see that a lot of people in the esoteric community, including the authors, the figures, the dominant people, simply aren't paying attention. And there's real easy ways to notice that. Okay. So when you have always had things fairly easy to get, and on top of it, they get easier and easier. So they go from being at the local bookstore to the occult bookstore to the New Age bookstore. See, now I'm going from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right, to Amazon. And we see all of these podcasts and all of these things available. Of course, it's easy. Now, even if in that case you've never met with anyone because you've never been in a group, and you've never talked to anyone who's been went through the National Socialist period or the Communist period, or even the suppression under the Iranian government. So you never meet anyone who's ever been through any of this. You don't have context for it. Even the idea of the suppression of Buddhism in Tibet is still really just a kind of a novel myth for most Western Buddhists, Western people. They don't really understand what that means in terms of roundups and destruction, crazy destruction, wanton destruction. Same thing with the other periods in Europe. I mean, I have letters here right next to me from people who experienced the suppression in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, 60s, and the communist period as well. I mean, even Franz Bardon. Well, they talk about his time in the concentration camp, but they forget that he died under communist custody. So this whole notion of living in an environment that is, we'll say, at best maybe supportive, and we don't really have that. The supportive would be something like, again, where it's a cultural phenomena, like India, Tibet, old China, other places around the world today. Neutral would be what we have. Where it's neutral, it's indifferent. Now, indifferent means just that, it's indifferent as long as you are doing your thing and you're not really bothering anybody or breaking any laws. No one really cares. And that's what it is. It becomes like the environment, just a transactional relationship. So there's no reason to think of the future because you're not really being asked to. I mean, when you buy a book, you're not being asked to think of the future.
So, I want to touch upon a couple of. I know you said we could do a laundry list of threats, and that's not really what this is about, but where your activities overlapped with concerns that I've repeatedly explored, come back to time and time again, where they overlap. I'd like to touch upon, say, a few areas, issues as I see them are problematic going forward, and you can comment or not, give me your take. One is first of all, we had in terms of technology of like books, that hasn't changed very much, but of course then we had digitization of everything, books, movies, music, you name it. And then we had the move away from physical. Now it seems that Kindle and other such ways of owning or reading, or not owning actually, but are reading books, didn't turn out to be the scene sweeping revolution that it was imagined it might be. However, in terms of the medium to long term, digitization of data, whatever that happens to be, in our case, we're thinking mainly about books. And then furthermore, storing in the cloud, as they call it, so we're like, where exactly is that? And we've seen how on a mundane level, with something like Netflix, how movies and TV series and what can suddenly disappear from the platform. I can't remember if it was Amazon or not, but one of the platforms famously, not that long ago, kind of took 1984. People who had quote unquote bought copies in 1984 digitally suddenly found that they were gone from their wallets or their whatever it's called if you own digital books, which I don't have any of those. And so for me, all of that's a question whether it's due to the failure of a grid or internet outages or deliberate, removal or sabotage of systems that digitized information. If you're thinking about relying on that going forward, as I say, well, I've scanned this old book, and then multiple copies of that scan exist now everywhere. We're safe. Seems to be a great problem, already proving to be problematic, as mentioned. And then you mentioned John Michael Greer. One thing that I remember reading about in the first book of his that I ever read, The Long Descent, was that even if sales of physical media are starting to creep back up again, DVDs, CDs, books. I mean, some of these sectors are overall in decline, but there's certain types of people, like myself, for example, who never gave up on these physical formats and are continue to acquire them, especially when they're dirt cheap. As Greer mentions in The Long Descent, 500 years from now, someone finds a DVD, a CD, and they don't know, what is this? Have we even got the technology or the knowledge to access the information held therein? Because one thing that when I used to own an allotment, a small holding, I don't know what you call that in the States, but one thing we did with old CDs that nobody wanted anymore was hang them up amongst the vegetables to scare the birds away. So, digitization presents, I'm talking mainly about the non-physical version of that. So presents a great threat to the preservation of information. Now, we're specifically concerned, of course, with esoteric and occult information, but just information society, culture-wide.
Well, in terms of esoteric information, it's very common. Just think of this. Remember the phrase, out of sight, out of mind. I can scan my shelves now in about 2 seconds. I can't scan my hard drive in that time. Yeah, maybe 4 seconds. I'm doing it right now. I can't do that with a hard drive. And anyone who's ever tried to find things on their hard drives knows what happens. Things get lost, files don't open, files degrade, you forget what you have. And electronic storage is very good for storage purposes. It's not necessarily great for retrieval. Books are great for retrieval, difficult for storage, which is really what we're talking about. They take space and they need environmental concerns and controls. Electronics do as well. Let's be honest with that too, but it's slightly different. However, a heavily damaged book is still repairable or at least readable or transcribable. A damaged hard drive is not. It's, if it's done, it's done. And we have to look at information in terms of what is important. One of the problems with the scanning and the electronic storage notion is that we lose sight of what is important. We tend to scan or save everything because we can. So there's a kind of bulimia that goes on. We're just, eating as much as we can because we can. But we never really digest it. We never really assimilate it. We just store more and more and more. So it never really gets integrated into a system of practice. The same thing with the problem with podcasts, publishing, and product. Those are very nice supports, but they're not practice. They're not an integrated system of practice. They're not a tradition. They're not something that's going to be conveyed generationally over 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 100 years. At least not without some serious effort to do so. And I don't think most people think of their podcasts as going to be around in 5 years, let alone 50.
No, I mean, I was thinking the other day about, this is something I've come to relatively late in life. I've been doing this. I've been doing some kind of media or publishing, since I was a teenager, but this is only like 11 or 12 years old. And it's like, I don't have any children. I mean, is anyone going to pay to keep my website up? The $200 or whatever it costs, or to do that every year and pay for the increasing bandwidth. Why would anyone really want to do that? And a few copies might survive. And just think about the tidal wave of just stick with podcasting. How much of that is actually out there in terms of information? And as you say, that bulimia, we're sort of information is not knowledge, as it were.
It's not. And this is what really needs to be hammered home. It's the same thing with all the TikTok stuff. Information is not knowledge. And this is where we find ourselves moving into this kind of Steinerian, Hermetic view, just to throw some terms out there for those who've been waiting for them. It's really where we're looking at people getting way too much into their heads. And that's the same thing with reading a book on the screen. There's a tactile involvement that makes learning from a book or a manuscript or even a magazine or a journal or even a photocopy very different than reading on a screen. And the thing is that manuscript or book or monograph or lecture that's 30, 40, 50, 100 years old, like the ones I have near me, they're talismanic in their true sense. They hold the energy of every person who's read them. They hold some of the energy of every person who's dedicated themselves to the practices they're in. And that carries them forward. Electronics don't do that. And if it does, certainly not to the same degree. So when we look at the tangibility, then, there's certain organizations I was once involved with, and I haven't been for a very, very long time, but still have connections, fortunately. And people tell me, getting this lecture sent to me as a PDF just isn't the same thing. Because everything else is sent to you as a PDF. Easy come, easy go. It has no difference. There's nothing special about it. No matter how you dress it up in terms of imagery or language, it's simply not special. And it becomes common. So what we've done is we've taken the esoteric and we've put it in the center square, and we've made it commonplace. And we've done just what, we see in the book, The Trickster and the Paranormal. What all of the problems were with that when the paranormal moves from the liminal to the center, things begin to fall apart. So we have to look at these ideas and where the place they hold in our lives and how they influence us. And in turn, how do they make us a better individual, a better person? And then how do we take that better personhood and work with others? How are we preparing the world? That was once a part of the fundamental premises of the teachings I received. I don't know if it still is for some of those organizations, but it was. And, well, there you have it. Preparing for the future is our obligation, because if others didn't do it, we wouldn't have had access to this. It simply wouldn't exist. So it really is about growing up. It's about, being the adult in the room. And I mean that in all seriousness. I really do. We have too many infantile views, too many childish views. And the biggest one is, in our fundraisers that we do, it's so funny. The biggest question I get is, isn't there some rich person who can stroke a check and solve this problem? I mean, this is the problem. We have people who want Santa Claus to solve their life. They want someone to sweep in and take the responsibility off their shoulders. You don't get to be an adept that way. Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me, or something to that effect. You've got to take the responsibility on your shoulders and carry that burden. And that's how you become an adept, not by shirking it and thinking someone else is going to take care of it for you. So we have to really demand more of the people who we're involved with. And that's okay. Saints have no time for fools, but we've decided we've got all the time in the world for fools. Yeah, and I'm serious about this. We know a fool by how they act and how they talk and how they do things. And here I'm gonna poke everybody in the eye, because I do this every 4 years after an election. If you're card reader or astrologer or seer or spirit guide or whatever, is telling you that the other person was going to win and they lost, especially if it was like a day or two before the election, whatever that election happens to be, you better get a new one. Because if they can't read the room, they need to shut up. And if they can't read the room and don't shut up, then you need to get a new one, because that's kind of what's happened. We've reduced, through publishing and the ease of publishing, we've reduced the notion of esoteric teachings and teachers down to kind of an intellectual exchange of knowledge with no expectations of efficacy. So when they're either unable to demonstrate the efficacy of what they've been writing about or talking about, it's just ignored. And that's the other part. That's why we're not really taken seriously often, because there's too much of that nonsense that goes on. You need to be held to some degree accountable for what you say. If we have the capacity to overcome time space without technology, going back to the role of technology, and to see into the future through these divination methods, and you're wrong, that's not a laughing matter. So when we come to you and tell you what's going to happen, and this happened on our first podcast, because it was back during the Corona years, and I made some statements that people just were viciously attacking me about. But they all turned out to be true.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com